welcome everyone to the History in Gaming panel, which is not history of gaming. Just remember what that preposition is there. Um, our panel description reads, from ancient history to the post-apocalyptic past that never was, games are often setting the stage with pieces of history. Our panelists will shout out some awesome games with historical elements, discuss great ways of incorporating history into a game, and talk about their own relationship to history in games. So I'd like to start by having each of our panelists introduce themselves, and I will go ahead and do just a quick introduction of myself. My name is Dawn Bogle. My pronouns are she, her. I am a gamer for 2/3 of my life, and I am also a history major and also aficionado. So while those two things do not necessarily intersect in my life, I like the possibility of their intersection. Let's go ahead and have Elena introduce yourself.
Hello everyone, I'm Alana, my pronouns are they, them. I've semi-recently got my master's degree in classical studies, so while I don't have any gaming making background, I do play games. I'm also a moderator for various gaming YouTubers, which done a panel on that yesterday. I also have 2 published articles about history and classical reception studies, which is mostly Caesar's Legion in Fallout New Vegas. As you can see, I am wearing a black and white shirt inspired by Benny from Fallout New Vegas because I love the game so much.
Excellent, thank you. Kate?
Hi, I'm Kate Hartfield. I'm an author in Ottawa, Canada. I've had a few of my own novels come out, The Valkyrie, The Embroidered Book, all of which tend to be in historical settings. It just seems to be what I return to over and over again. And short fiction, where I bounce around a little bit more. And I've also written a couple of games. So I have 2 projects for Choice of Games, The Magician's Workshop and The Road to Canterbury, which are both in historical settings, and they are both shortlisted for a Nebula in game writing, which was fantastic. And I've done a little bit of work on a video game called Evil Genius 2, and some other little tiny bits of video game writing on the side. And I also write a tie-in novel series based in the Assassin's Creed universe. So I remembered to bring The Megas Conspiracy is the first one in that series, which came out last year. And the second one is almost out. It's coming out in a few months. So I come at it from a few different directions.
All right, and Benjamin.
Cool. I liked The Road to Canterbury, I gotta say.
Oh, thank you.
Well, my name is Benjamin Rosenbaum. I am an author and lately a game designer. I have been a science fiction author for 20 years, a lot of short fiction novels called The Unraveling. Some of that is historical, including a couple of, a sort of a little series of pseudo-epigraphy Jewish stories that are like set in the Bible and the Talmud. And I got into game. I mean, I've always played games, and I've really been interested in history and games. Both, I think this topic can be very wide-ranging because video games very interesting, and also tabletop games. So I'm been playing a lot of tabletop games, and so the game that I published is Dream Apart, which is a historical Jewish fantasy game. So it's in the 19th century Eastern Europe, and there's ghosts and golems and things. And I published it together. I shamelessly rode the coattails of Avery Alder, who's kind of a story game big shot, and her game Dream Askew inspired Dream Apart was a hack of it, and then I corresponded with her, and we were like, let's publish this together. So we did a Kickstarter together, which was kind of an amazing way to enter the game space. And then we had a chapter in the book about how you could make your own game like ours, and I was like, that's just a gimmick to fill out the book. No one's going to do that. But then a lot of people did, so now there's like belonging outside belonging, which is apparently a thing. And so that's a game that was very much in a historical, fantastical setting. And then I'm using the same setting for a Choice of Games title called The Ghost and the Golem, which I'm frantically trying to finish up. So it should be out it's already up on Steam, the page, but for pre-order, but it's should be done sometime soon, I hope, this summer maybe, and shipping this summer. So and that's also, and I would be interesting to talk about the difference between different, genre and media, and like tabletop versus computer games and so on, and how history functions. Anyway, excited for this panel.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. So, interestingly enough, that is actually my first question to you all: is how does the medium of the game, whether it's tabletop RPG, video game, interactive fiction, influence how you include the historical details in your game? And Kate, can we start with you?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think the first factor obviously will be how much text you have, or maybe I just think that because I tend to be a prose writer. But I think having a lot of text makes it easy in some ways, because you have the opportunity to just explain, where you are in the world, and to put in some backstory and dates and names and that kind of thing. Of course, the temptation then is to do too much of that, and you have to find a balance, as you do with all historical fiction. But I think especially in games, you really have to have a light hand with that stuff as you go along. But games that are more visual, I think, have another advantage in the sense that they can just immerse you immediately in the sights and sounds and smells. And if you think about something like 80 Days, I think really combines sort of both worlds in terms of text and this feeling of immersion. And I mean, and one of the things that made me jump at the chance to write in the Assassin's Creed universe is that those games do such a fantastic job of making you feel like, wow, I am actually standing on the roof of Notre Dame. And it feels so real, and so that's something that prose can't do. So I think that's one factor in it.
What about you, Benjamin?
Well, this is a really interesting question for me, because since I just had this experience of first writing this tabletop game, and then essentially being like, I'm going to take the same setting and write an interactive fiction game based on it, and I sort of naively assumed it would be pretty similar. I was like, well, it's like I already built out this game. The thing about a tabletop role-playing game, particularly like a story game like this one, is it's so much, it's very much a collaboration with the players and at the table. So they are going to actually tell the story, and that's an interesting challenge for a historical game. And I very much, through playtesting, realized that people were very inhibited about playing, especially such a free form. It's not like it's a GM-less sort of story now, make it up as you go along game, designed for to have a lot of trenchant prompts that will let people jump in and so on. And the game I based it on, Avery Alder's game, which is set in the future in kind of post-apocalyptic queer enclave, does that really well. But I noticed in playtesting that people would choke up about history. They were like, I don't want to get it wrong. Like, particularly history of a marginalized group, particularly the non-Jews playing the game were like, I don't want to say anything wrong. So I had to really work in iterations of the game a lot on, giving people permission to be like, it's not going to be real history. You're inventing your own alternate history. As long as the point is to get outside of fantasy cliches. So you're using a different worldview, a different mythology, a different kind of, if you can soak up, and I put in a lot of source material, little snippets of things, so they could like draw from things and get the vibe. But you're not gonna get it right. So I had to encourage a lot not to get it right. And when I went to write the prose game, the interactive fiction game, I realized it's a very different ball game, because I'm writing the words, and I started in this kind of vaguely historical, ahistorical, like it's the shtetl, like the mythical, and then I very quickly realized I was not very comfortable with that. Like I wasn't even ethically, like I was not very comfortable with it just being, because the Hebrew school, vaguely, family history version I grew up with, it was like, almost like an ahistorical eternal cycle of like, well, there are always pogroms, that was, the Jews were living in fear and this and that. And the more I got into research the history, I was like, no, these are very different historical time periods. Like, and I had mashed up things. Like, so in the original version of the game, as I first drafted, I got to like chapter 4 and I realized this was wrong, that I had both like conscription of Jewish boys at 12 to go off to the Tsar's army, and also like this brewing pogrom where there were going to be riots. And those are like 50 years apart. Like there was an era where they were like trying to make the Jews into Russians and drafting them at 12. And then like 30 years later, then the pogroms really started in 1881. So it's like, and instead of it sort of being always the same way bad, it was like, there were so many up and downs in history, and every generation had such a completely different experience, that I was forced to be like more and more accurate and bring more and more detail, just because I found myself backing myself into a corner. And the amusing version end of the story is I actually ended up revising and figuring out and whatever, and it came down to there was only one day. There was literally one day in 1881 where the game can happen. Because I was like, well, it has to be after the assassination of the Tsar, and then there was these wave of programs, so it's got to be in the spring. And then I was like, fine. And then I realized that's during the counting of the Omer, when Orthodox Jews don't have weddings, and there's a wedding. So I was like, oh no. But then I was like, oh, but on Lag BaOmer, which is the 33rd day, you can have a wedding. It's literally one day.
Amazing.
So like the weird from like anything of the 19th century, just pull in whatever you like, down to like May 7th, 1881 was like the transition of those two media.
Wow. And Elena, you had mentioned wanting to talk a little bit about the military aspects that you see in games. So if you want to talk about that and how that detail gets added into or left out of games, I'd love that.
Yeah, unfortunately, we kind of see it a little bit too often. Like, okay, this Total War franchise is great, and obviously there is war in the name, and the main focus of it is conquest. But then you've got something more like Civilization, which can have like faith and science wins, and like there are other ways of winning than just who has the strongest army who can defeat everybody else on the map. So for me, something like, I'm so sorry, I'm going to mention this game constantly, but Fallout New Vegas does it so well because it takes the history that actually existed and just plops it into a different place. Like, you have this post-apocalyptic setting, there's been a nuclear war, like, the entire like culture has been utterly destroyed. This one guy finds a couple of books and goes, I'm going to cosplay, I'm going to LARP for the rest of my life and see who else is going to come along with me. Takes the actual history. There were slaves in ancient Roman era, like in late Republic, into the Imperial. There was a lot of misogyny, and that is also in the game. Like, the Legion are often seen as the evil one, and rightly so, but they're only taking what was actually in history that has been kind of left out and forgotten. Like, we often kind of gloss over the bad stuff of history. History has always been terrible. We are living in history right now. It has always been terrible for almost everybody. Like, there is a select few people who can like go to any point in history and be like, yeah, okay, this is pretty cool, I'm gonna stay here. Like, very, very few people though for like the entire history. So for me, like, speculative like gaming, like putting history into another setting, into another time period, like picking up from what Benjamin said about getting things right. Studying history has really shown me that there is no right, because we've got very different perspectives on the same event depending on who's writing it and when they're writing it and why they're writing it. Like, if you look at, you know, the assassination of Caesar, for some people it was a good thing, it was killing a tyrant, it was bringing Rome back to power, and for other people it was absolute chaos and terrible, and he did the right thing because he was populist. And that's just one death of one guy. If you have that for the entirety of human history, there's always going to be a perspective that challenges what you're putting into a game, whether that's a like normal video game or a TTRPG.
Excellent, thank you. So I think this question is going to be great for Benjamin to start with, though he already touched on it a little bit, and that is, where, if anywhere, do you have to fudge the historical details for the sake of game playability? Or do you have to find a way to make it work within accurate recorded history?
Yeah, that is a great question. I think that very much depends, of course, on the medium and the expectations that you set for the reader and so on. You know, as I said, like in the two games that I was comparing, one of them is like, this is not, you know, we're drawing from history. You're making your own thing that you're inspiring, and, you know, we're going to give you tidbits and it's a buffet. The other one, I feel under pressure, and it's actually interesting that one interesting thing about this question is it's a little like with translation. If you're translating something, you can translate the words as close as possible. That's a very different exercise than translating it so that the reader will get the same impression that the person who originally read it would have, right? Like I actually was just helping translate a prayer book from which, the stuff, the prayers are like 2,000 years old. It's not, the vibe is not going to be the same for somebody reading it today. The king, calling God a king, I was like, oh yeah, a king, of course we got kings. Now that's like, really a king? Like, you know what I mean? Like, so similarly, the when I was doing this more recent game, and I do want to stick to the history, but one of the interesting things is that the pogrom of 1881, where I said it, come to find out, not that bad a pogrom. Not many people died. It was widespread. I mean, it was terrifying because it hadn't happened before. So it left this cultural memory of like absolute horror. But what's interesting is that there was like, I don't know, 100 deaths across the entirety of the Russian Empire. Later in 1917, you have pogroms that kill like hundreds of thousands of people. So it super ran. I grew up thinking of it as kind of a 19th century phenomenon. It was like a little. It was a throat clearing exercise in the 19th century, right? By the time you get to the post World War I, it's like practically, it's like now it's really a warm up for the beta for the Holocaust. But like 1881. So, but on the other hand, this is probably the only game like this people are going to play. So I keep wavering between, on the one hand, like I feel like making it, over exaggerating it how bad it was is actually unfaithful to the history and it to some extent unfair, and portrays reifies certain people as villains and others as victims and so on. On the other hand, I'm like, I don't want it to be a cozy pogrom either. It's like, oh, it wasn't much, So capturing that, both the emotional truth and the literal truth, it's not even just for playability, but also just in terms of communicating it as art. And then, I mean, obviously for playability, as Kate said, you got to pick about what you put in and what you take out and not overwhelm people and kind of summarize. And, very often there's a bell curve of possible people and it's kind of like, okay, well, maybe there wouldn't have been many, outspoken women klezmers, taking the stage, bossing the guys around, but there could have been. Like, that is not outside the realm of possibility. Wouldn't be typical, but I can have one, right? So that's, so there's a range of things that are but as I said, I did do some revisions where it was like, oh, they didn't draft kids anymore at this point. So I had to go in and revise all the scene where they were going to draft the kids to the old lieutenant reminiscing about how they used to draft the kids. So there are workarounds. Anyway.
Yeah. Elena, what do you think?
The game Rise Son of Rome springs to mind as this because it's set during Nero's middle age. Nero died when he was 30. It's got a British revolt, which didn't happen, with Boudicca, who was not during the reign of Nero. It has ancient Greek technology, which was used with an Athenian war against Sparta, which is several hundred years prior to Nero. So I think getting the history right, and it's, to me, it's that weird kind of mix of let's play with what's there and let's make it as accurate as we can, but also let's sometimes throw out the rulebook and have Boudica and the barbarians storm Rome because it looks badass. It makes your protagonist feel badass to be going down the Via Appia with a broadsword in hand and just charging, forgetting every aspect of military training to stay in formation. It just, it makes your characters badass, and to hell with the history, I guess.
It's something that I've heard.
But then for other games, like Benjamin says, sometimes you do need it to be on that one very specific day because the history is what's important. The narrative can be important or the history can be important, but if you want both to happen, you have to be reading every single primary source to find out just what was happening and when and why.
It reminds me of the idea in gaming of the rule of cool, where you know what, that's cool, so let's do it, sort of thing.
Yes, exactly.
Kate, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's really fascinating, and I think what Benjamin's been talking about, with the player expectations, I think, are really interesting, because one of the things that we do with all kinds of historical fiction, I think, is we're often sort of shifting the lens a little bit, knowing that readers are coming in with certain expectations that may be overly simplistic, or even inaccurate, or the product of many years of a sort of propaganda narrative. And so one of the things that we do with historical narratives is ask questions and say, actually, what you think about this may not be accurate, and that's really difficult to do when you are collaborating with the players, and the players are bringing in their own understanding of what history looks like. So especially in the TTRPG, I think that's really an interesting dilemma. But with all games, it is, especially because we do have this sort of protagonist problem where we're often, not always, but often with games, we really do want to have players have the sense of agency and control, which can be in tension with the historical narrative. So I think one example that comes to mind in my own work, I mentioned The Road to Canterbury, which is based on the Canterbury Tales, and the idea is that you are playing a pilgrim traveling with Chaucer on the road to Canterbury in the 14th century in England. And I wanted to have some social mobility, right? I wanted the player to be able to decide, okay, I want to be an abbess, I want to be a knight, I want to be a clerk, I want to be whatever. There's sort of a bunch of different options. So I had to think, okay, well, and it may be stretching a little bit what was possible at the time, but I wanted it to sort of feel at least authentic and grounded in history. So what I would do is I would look for the examples of individuals who had sort of made lateral changes in their community, or had even changed their status, or had become noble when they weren't before, and that kind of thing. And I thought, okay, well, what are some of the ways that happens? And I tried as much as possible to borrow from that, so that it wasn't completely just, oh, sure, you can be a knight if you want to, because that would just feel inauthentic.
Yeah. And I know that from other conversations that we've had about historical fiction in general, you've run into issues with names. Did you want to talk about that, any?
Yeah, names are sort of a classic problem, I think, with historical fiction. I mean, the one that I think many people are familiar with is Joe Walton. I think is one of the coiners of the term the Tiffany problem, which is that Tiffany is a perfectly authentic medieval name, but you can't use it because people will not recognize it as being medieval. So and this problem crops up all the time. Yeah, it is something that you have to think about, and names can be really important in games even more than in other kinds of historical narratives, because they're so central to character and everything else. So my problem in writing the tie-in novels for the Assassin's Creed games is that the universe is so big now that all of the names have been used. So I've got to Google every name before I use it now.
Then you have the issue that everybody had the same name in your embroidered book. Yeah.
Oh yeah, the Habsburgs. Don't get me started on the Habsburgs. Yeah, I mean, that's
everybody's
the thing,
Maria something.
Everybody's Maria something, and yeah, everybody who's written, particularly sort of upper class European families in certain centuries, and not only were certain names really popular, but they would often name children after their deceased siblings, and so you'd have three sons named Charles in a given family, and it's really, really difficult not only to research that, but then to convey that to the reader, who is like, I'm how many Charleses are in this book again? And I give up.
Yeah. All of that is good things to keep in mind when you're trying to figure out, how accurate can I be and still make this fun, I think is the important, whether it's a game or a book or something. Because if I'm reading a book and I'm having to figure out, is this Charles A, B, or C, it's going to make it a harder read. And same thing in a game. If you've got all this detail that, wait, who am I dealing with now? So one of the other questions that I had for you all is, what are some games that you've played that do an excellent job with including history in the game? And we've obviously mentioned some already. And if you want to just name maybe one or two, because I'm sure that we could go on for all day with naming these. And then if we want to talk about more, we can put those in the chat in the Discord so that people can go after the panel and look at those. So Elena, what do you think?
Fallout New Vegas. It's like the obvious answer. Yeah, Fallout New Vegas. I've written way too much
Yeah.
and bored way too many people talking about the history in that game.
Are there any others that you like?
I think Rome Total War is really interesting with like the political things between like the Julius family, and like you then have to like split up Rome, and then there's like the civil war which happens in the game, which is really cool. So I think, yeah, Rome Total War and Fallout New Vegas.
Perfect.
Wow,
Excellent.
unpredictable.
Kate, what about you?
Um, well, I will say that my comfort game for decades has been Civilization. Civilization 6 now is which is not exactly historically rigorous.
Sure.
but it is a comfort game. But some more sort of detailed games. I want to shout out an indie game that's still in development called Manor Lords, Manor Lords, which is a sort of medieval building game. And I've done a little bit of writing for them, and it looks really cool. And the other thing I want to talk about is Choice of Games, which both Benjamin and I have written for. They have a ton of historical titles, and there's just so many. So do check out their catalog. One of my favorites is An Odyssey: Echoes of War by Natalia Teodoridou, which is the story of the Odyssey, and it's really beautifully done.
That one, is that the one that's up for an award this year?
No. That's another one.
His game, Sins, Vampire the Masquerade, Sins of the Sires, I think is up for the Nebula.
Okay, so that is, yeah. I don't know if that one's got much historical to it, though. With vampires,
I think it also is. Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of Greek history. I think it's set in Athens.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
All right, Benjamin, what about you? What are some games you want to name drop?
Well, two things I wanted to shout out in this context. One, which was a big influence on Dream Apart, is Sagas of the Icelanders, which is a indie powered by the apocalypse historical game in which you're in Iceland during the sagas, kind of. And I mean, it's similar. Its relationship to history is kind of similar to Dream Apart. It's not exact. It's just drawing from, but it's very much and there's a lot of it that feels very distinct. I mean, it feels I think a lot of. Unlike a lot of sort of cinematic style of role-playing games where there's a lot of battles and like I don't know, people are taking arrows and wounds and crawling up and Sagas of the Islanders is much more like somebody hits you and you fall down and die. Like it's sort of like because in the sagas I think combat's often like pretty brutal and brutally efficient, and it's like and then he killed him, and so there's like, and it's a lot of cold and you're kind of starving all the time. Like it has a real like gritty Icelandic saga feel. But one of the things that really struck me about it that was a big influence on Dream Apart was that it's a very gendered society. Men and women have different roles, and it's and when I was thinking about writing a game in the shuttle, I didn't want to just gloss over and be like, oh no, I'm going to replace the actual way that patriarchy functioned with some kind of happy utopia where everybody gets to be like they don't care if a woman's a rabbi. Like this, no, that's not true. They did care, but also I didn't want to make it this game in which the boys do all the fun things and the women are like, what I mean, or it's only Yentl, like you have to dress up as a boy to have any agency. And the great thing Sagas of the Icelander does is it looks at this very dichotomous patriarchal society, but it really thinks about the kind of agency that people have. So the basic character types are like man and woman, and they have distinct moves which are mechanically just as powerful as one another. And like men, like men fighting, like and there are people who vary. Like there's these, I don't know how you pronounce it, but there's like androgynous type men with magic, and then there's, or maybe magic, and there's like shield maidens. There's some people who break the mold, but even people who are conforming to the gender narrative, there's like a lot of agency. And like there's a great move in Saga of the Islanders where women, if you're playing a woman, you can shame a man, and that has tremendous social consequences, like calling him a coward to his face. It's like he is so it and I was like, oh, that's interesting. Like, what would a player character type be of a matchmaker? What would a player character type of a midwife be? These have an enormous kind of specific power that they can wield in certain ways. And we just think about, I don't know, sorcerers, and I mean, sorcerer could be either, but, we think about these different, not just saying, okay, everybody can dress up in armor and carry a sword, but looking at what is actually what was actually powerful and had agency and moved history about people in roles that don't get limelighted. Anyway, so that was it. Saggers the Icelanders. The other thing I wanted to shout out, just because we were talking about war, and I also really like Civilization and various games, but I always like uneasy in a way with all the, and even going back to D&D, like all the games where it's like conquer stuff, get more stuff, now you can conquer more stuff, like that engine always makes me nervous. I really like games that have some other take on it, and a terrific war game that flips the narrative is, I mean, it's not a war game about war, is This War of Mine, which actually only played the board game version of. I think I know there's a computer version of it, and that's supposed to be great too. But the board game version is really intense, and it is historical in a vague way. I mean, it sort of fouled the serials numbers off, but it's recent history. But it's it certainly feels like the Siege of Sarajevo. I don't know if that's 100% intentional, but it's definitely like a Balkan type war. But it feels very. And it's a great thing about, I mean, it's just your civilians surviving, like, and just scavenging and making all these like gut-wrenching moral choices. And it manages to make that fun. I mean, fun is interesting in this context, but it does manage to make it like engaging and profluent, and you're drawn in, and like you really are immersed in it, without trivializing it, and without making it any less bleak. I mean, the bleakness is very central. So, yeah. Those two.
Cool. Yeah, one that I'd like to add into this is another, I believe it's Powered by the Apocalypse, but it may be, there have been some variations on the Powered by the Apocalypse games, but Night Witches.
Oh, yeah.
Which
Jason
is the women fighter pilots of Russia in World War II.
Yeah.
And it uses a slightly different version of Powered by the Apocalypse, which is why I'm not 100% sure that that's the actual basis, because you run missions and things like that. But it presents some really interesting things, especially on gender. And I mean, because regardless of your personal gender, you will be playing a female character in this game. And also some interesting things about sexuality on a historical level. There is very much the possibility of playing a queer character in this game with consequences that are historically accurate. And that is actually, I wanted to use that also to segue into another question, and that is, when you're dealing with a historical game, how do you approach things like gender and sexuality in historical periods and cultures where there's a high level of patriarchy and women are seen as second class citizens, and also in places where alternative sexualities are very much persecuted, which, obviously that can be in a modern setting as well, but in historical games it seems to be all the more prevalent. And I will toss this out to who would like to start. Go ahead.
So, again, I apologize, my area of expertise is Julius Caesar. He had a sexual and romantic relationship with another man. Like, that is actual historical fact. Like, that has been recorded by many primary sources and like contemporary to like when he was alive. Like, saying Caesar is queer is not going to look good in any game, because he's like this manly man, he conquered Europe, he did all these things. Yeah, but he was also queer, and he had a disability. Putting those two things together doesn't really match with the expectations of the public consciousness. There's not a pop culture thing of a queer disabled Julius Caesar that we can just like put out there and not have questions raised, and then go, actually, here's some primary sources. Here's a lot of primary sources. So I think for when you've got queer historical figures, there's going to be the question of, what do the sources say? For like, first of all, how did they personally identify? Like, what was the culture at the time like? Were they gay? Did they have the term that we would use now, or is the term that they would use what we would now consider an insult? And I think that's a really delicate line. It takes a lot of sensitivity to go, yes, this character had this type of relationship but do we label it? Like, even me saying Caesar was queer, I'm putting a modern label onto a figure that didn't use that term, because that's the term from like the 1980s. So I think that's like one of the biggest things of like, what labels do you use? And if you don't use labels, is that then a choice? Are you just going for the like aesthetics of the relationship? Are you showing them to be in a romantic relationship? How are you showing that? There's a lot of like queer baiting in like fiction and media where you do have characters that look like they could be in a relationship, but they don't take that step to actually like show the intimacy. So there's that kind of balance between the public consciousness, like, and what the public see, the primary sources, our modern terms and sensibilities, and trying to squish all those into one simple thing that is meant to be fun. I don't know how people do it. And
Right.
like genuinely impresses me whenever I see this happen. And like massive imposter syndrome moment, I'm just an academic. Like, I don't make games, I play games. I write about games in a way that like other academics can go, guess maybe. So having that kind of awe is just, yeah, I'm in awe of anyone who can manage that.
Well, Kate or Benjamin, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it is it is a question with all historical narratives, um, to that tension between you do want to be true to the time, and also I think to be pushing back against the erasure of many identities in history, and pushing back against the sort of homogenized view of the roles of, for example, women in history, and explaining that a lot of the stories we've been told about women in history are simple or inaccurate. So I think that's always part of the job, and then there's also with gaming, I think in particular, it's even harder to put the player character into a situation where they're going to then experience oppression, for example. And I think that that's just an ethical choice that is even more severe in a game than in a novel, for example. I mean, if you write a novel about a person who is being oppressed in their society, then that's one way of experiencing the story. But some people, when they're playing a game and they're actually the one making the choices, can experience that in an extremely personal way. So I just think it's something to be aware of as writers. It doesn't mean don't do it. It just means that when you're writing a game, you are asking someone to inhabit a character in a particular way, which can be really powerful, but can also be just an intense experience in a lot of ways.
Benjamin?
Yeah, I really love everything that you guys said, and I think that it's I I I wanted to make lots of room for queerness in both of the shuttle games that I was doing, and I also wanted it not, as I said, sort of not to be this sort of cleaned up utopia, but like, oh, no one minds. No, they mind. But the thing about it is that I am really interested in going back and saying, well, but how did everybody? There always was oppression, right? As Alana was saying, history sucked for most people most of the time, but also there was always resistance, right? There was always agency. Like, people always fought back. They always found ways to fight back. They fought back by defying norms, and also by employing norms, and living within them, or hiding aspects of themselves, and making spaces for others. So like, and the thing about the terminology is interesting too. Like, I want people to feel this. I want people to feel like, be able to play a queer character in the shtetl and feel like awesome, and like they have agency, and like there's a lot going on, but also it's different, and so you definitely have the option to run away. You have so it's set up so you have two friends, one of each gender, and in the code they're queer friend and eligible friend, and like one of them you could run away with, or like you could like decide to never marry and have like a Boston marriage where you like, everyone wonders why those two bachelors or spinsters are rooming together. You can marry the other one. Like, that's not gonna, do you know what I mean? Like, mama's never gonna approve of you. It's But that nonetheless, it's like there's a lot of choices and a lot of possibilities and a lot of ways you could construct that life. And the way the vocabulary thing is interesting too, because I don't want anyone to bump up against, don't want it to feel, I want it to feel joyful, but not anachronistic, not for them to be like, well, that's not really. So even the way that like your self-understanding, also with characters being trans and intersex, interestingly, the Shtetl Society was a lot more progressive about intersex characters, people than American society was at the time I was born. I mean, there's like 7 classifications of, and that's like no big deal. I mean, not that it's no big deal, but like a lot less than like 19th century Eastern European shuttle was a lot better about intersex than like, I don't know, 1950s America. Anyway, but so there's all these possibilities, but the way that you talk about them and the way like when you know, if you tell your friend about it, and if so, like what they say about it is very I really tried to go back and draw on sources and find out what ways people would have thought of such things. And so rather than being like, I'm trans, it's sort of like, well, I have the soul of a man, even though I was born in the body of a woman. Like that's something that people would say, like their reincarnation, like Gilgul, like I was trans, like I must be, you'd explain this to your friend and they're like, oh, you must have been transmigrated from like an earlier life. Like it's a way that somebody in the 19th century would realistically have articulated this, even if it doesn't map one-to-one with the way that we think about it now. And so, squaring that circle. And I was going to say something about the Yentl, right? The famous story most people know from the Barbra Streisand movie. And what's interesting is going back, it's interesting also not just that the way we see history is different than the way necessarily that it saw it, but that it keeps changing. So in the 1970s, when Barbra Streisand made Yentl, Isaac Bashevis Singer was like, this sucks, you changed Yentl. And everybody was like, Isaac Bashevis Singer is an old sexist guy. She made Yentl free, right? In the end of the movie, Yentl sails off to America, has put back on a dress, is able to, study the law like she wants to as a woman in America, the land of the free. And Isaac Bashevis Singer was like, Yentl would never do that. Yentl was Anshul. Yentl wants to go and study in the yeshiva. Why would Yentl go to America and put back on a dress? And like reading it now, I was reading a paper in which I was like, oh, Yentl is, I read a good paper from like 10 years ago, and they were like, well, Yentl's a trans man. Because actually in Yiddish, Isaac Bashevis Singer always uses the pronoun he after Yentl becomes Anshul. So it's actually Yentl is Yentl is Anshul. But when I read that paper, I was like, oh yeah, Yentl's a trans man. And then I went back and looked at the story, and I was like, wait a minute, no. Men keep saying to Yentl, like Avigdor and Yentl's father, when Yentl explains Yentl to them, they go, oh, you have the soul of a man. That explains it. That explains why you study with it. But every time Yentl is like, no, I am neither. Like Yentl's non-binary. So that's like, even reading this paper from 10 years ago, I was like, no, it's changed again. And like the eyes through which we can look at this story. Anyway, anyway, so I was drawing on a lot of that stuff. The stuff was there, right? Like there are sources. You can see how this stuff lives, and it's so you can imagine your way into like how would they have seen it, and give people the sense of like having agency and this divert like all there were always all kinds of people.
Yeah.
And people have always people, and we've always put people into boxes. People will look back on now and be like, why were you so restrictive about things we're doing now that we don't even notice? And people have always resisted those boxes. So
Yeah. Yeah. In my own research, I've done a bit with mostly queer women in the Regency period and the idea of Boston marriages, or, basically two women who choose to live together as friends. That's acceptable in the culture.
yeah.
Two men trying to do that? No, it's not. And it's interesting to see the way in which that was gendered to a certain extent, where men could be prosecuted for this, whereas women really wouldn't, unless you were pretending to be a man, and then that was fraud.
Mm,
But
yeah.
if you are just two women living together, you do you. But yeah, to see the gendered, but then also to see the way that people considered themselves. So you've got the example of Anne Lister, who absolutely considered herself gay. I mean,
Hmm.
she loved women, and that was her thing. But then you've got the ladies of Langolan, who were two women who lived together their whole lives and may not have ever had a sexual relationship with one another. But were they still lesbians? they could have been asexual lesbians, or they could have been, just two women who were very close friends. And, there's certainly terminology plays into that a lot with what somebody considered themselves versus what our modern view of them considers it.
Yeah,
But
I just, oh,
yeah,
sorry.
go ahead. Go ahead.
No, just to jump in on that, I think, yeah, it's really, I think often sometimes it feels awkward going back into history and not using terminology, but I think the best thing is really just to listen to the people of the time. And like you're both saying, often they had their own terminology, and if you just go along with that, it's a lot simpler and easier. And I found the same thing like with Yentl as with the Chevalier d'Eon when I was writing about her and the embroidered book, because if you read historians, it's all, oh, it's very complicated, what was this person's gender identity, and then if you actually read her own writing from the time she was middle-aged, she said, I'm a woman, deal with it. And that was it. Like, that was the only thing she ever said consistently. And so it's not that complicated, I think, to us now, but in the 50s or whatever, people would well, what does that mean? So yeah, I think listening is so important.
Yeah, and that's the thing too, is when you're doing research for these historical games, keep an eye on when your sources are from, because it changes. Like you were saying, Benjamin, 10 years ago, this article saying trans man, and then the book itself is actually saying non-binary. But the way that historians have approached this in the past is not necessarily the way that they approach it now, and that's important to keep in mind.
Yeah,
But we
similar to
are,
what you were saying. I mean, that's another recent shift, is what you were saying, where it's like, I think 20 years ago, there's like, oh, well, these two women lived together and were passionately close to one another. Come on, they were gay. And now people are like, no, there is such a thing as asexual. Like there is even other possibilities. There are, right? So
yeah.
we keep the targets keep,
Yes, yes. We are getting close to the end of our time, and I don't think we've had any questions, but if any of our attendees wanted to ask any questions, now would be the time to pop them in, or if we don't quite have time for that, you can ask them on the Discord. We are the Houdini room, though I am going directly from this panel to another panel, so I will not be able to answer questions on this one just yet. But let's wrap up with quick where to find you online, and anything you'd like to shout out of your own or someone else's. Elena, are you willing to start?
Sure. You can find me at Twitter as @Elana_. I post to working classes, which is a thing that I would really like to shout out. They focus on people who are like the working class who want to study classics, and yeah, I love it. I'm hoping also to do my PhD in gaming and classical studies. So if that happens, you will see it first on Twitter.
Very cool, very cool. Kate?
So I'm going directly to the next panel in the next hour on games we love in other media. So if you want to hear more talk about games, I will be there in 10 minutes. And I'm around Twitter and Mastodon in the Wandering Shop as Kate Hartfield. I'm on Instagram as Kate Hartfield. And yeah, just like Dawn, I'm happy to answer questions on the Discord and chat further about this stuff. But it'll be an hour delayed because I have another panel.
All right, and Benjamin?
Yeah, and we should probably post links and stuff. You got when you get a chance, put that in the Discord.
Yes, definitely.
So I'm Ben_Rosenbaum on Twitter and also Wandering Shop. What do you call that? We're on the same
Instance.
That should have a name, like
yeah.
Instance
Instances.
Buddies. Yeah. Yes, Instance Buddies. Okay. And yes, and BenjaminRosenbaum.com. It's the website. I'll put links in the Discord to the two games I mentioned.
Excellent. And I am Dawn Vogel. You can find me at historythatneverwas.com. And on Twitter, I am historyneverwas. The character limit wouldn't let me use my whole name. But it's been great chatting with all of you. Thank you so much for your insight onto this stuff. And I really appreciated having this conversation. And
Thanks
I
so
hope
much for
everyone
moderating.
has a great rest of their convention.